Andrew Body to Alabama State is an interesting move, but after a couple of days, I'm starting to see the vision. Oh, yeah, it's locked on HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make it Locked On HBCU, your first listen of the day, every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off doesn't mean the journey's over. Just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. And these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions do apply. We wrap up today's episode with a look at FAMU versus Grambling women's basketball, because this very well could be the game of the year up to this point. Prior to that, the XFL-USFL merger, great for spring football. I love it as a fan of the sport, but as an advocate for HBCU athletes and really all athletes who aren't able to make it to the league, I don't know if I like this move as much. But prior to this, let's look at a move I also originally did not like, but I've come to grips with it. Andrew Body, yes, that Andrew Body, the former Texas Southern starting quarterback, is now an Alabama State Hornet. And I want to look at how Body fits in this Bama State offense. Now, first and foremost, because alma maters are involved here, let's get this out of the way. Shout out to Body and his family. Always been good to me. Got nothing bad to say about him or his people, to be honest with you, right? I believe in this guy. I think that when people say stuff about their favorite team or their alma mater or their favorite school or whatever they're connected to, people jump to say bias. And I've gone on my high horse about this before. I won't do it this time. But sometimes it's not bias. Sometimes it's just you pay more attention and and you become aware of these things. And that's how I felt about Andrew Body. I just was aware, and I'm very honest. This is an extremely talented quarterback. I think he showed it in his sophomore season. I think he showed it in the first game of his junior season. It didn't all go the way that he wanted. It didn't all go the way that he wanted. It didn't go all the way that I wanted it. But I thought that there was moments in that game against PV where you saw just how talented that Body was. It was on full display. I think people who say he isn't talented, more so than me being biased, I think you hate him. That's how I look at it. I think that Body is an extremely talented quarterback. Now, the thing that, and I know when you say these kind of disclaimers, it feels like, but there's no but coming here. There's no but coming here. I think that his talent was the reason I was a tad bit confused about him going to Alabama State. Hopefully he does well there, of course. Unless they face TSU, then I hope he's trashed that game and regains form the game afterwards. I mean, he understands. Like, come on now. But his talent as a thrower is the reason I was initially confused about this decision. We're done with the disclaimers now. We're getting into the analysis. I was like, Andrew Body, you can slang the rock. Coach Robinson ain't really seeming, at least his comments going into last season, to be too keen about throwing the ball like that. He seems like a guy who wants to run the ball. Now, I think there's two things to think about. One, even if that's his way to coach, you have a player who can make you defy. If you're a good coach, you'll have players who you adapt to your personnel. And I think that's Andrew Body. The second is his skill set does allow him to be in a run offense. I just believe he needs to be the focal point. That was the confusion for me. Is I'm sitting here like, Andrew Body went to Bama State, and I found out by stinking Mason Smith calling me. I'm trying to get some food, and this man is calling me to tell me, hey man, you hear the news? Do you hear the news? But also, when I look at his skill set, right? Because on one hand, you do have to adapt to your personnel, but then on the other hand, I don't think that adapting to Andrew Body is going to be that difficult. I would envision, and this will probably take a little bit of compromise, at least on Robinson's part, I would imagine a Davius Richard type of role for Andrew Body. Now, when you look at Body in his sophomore year, which was 2022 at Texas Southern, he was the second leading rusher on the team, but he had the most carries. I don't think that I wouldn't want to replicate that. I wouldn't want my quarterback to have the most carries on my team. Like, he was a really good runner. Don't get me wrong. If you go back to his 2022 stats and compare them to other rushers around the country, or not around the country, but around the conference, then you'll see a guy who, on a per game basis, was a really good runner, which is why I compare him to Davius Richard. But Davius Richard is not a dual threat quarterback who is made by his legs. Richard is a quarterback who is a dual threat because he is equally threatening through the air and on the ground. That's how I view a peak Andrew Body, as somebody who can tear you up on the ground. He can tear you up through the air. And I think that duality is going to be important, because when we go back to why I question this, and I'm thinking about him as a passer, which is why I'm glad that I took a couple of days. If I would have given an immediate reaction, I would have felt bad about my take, because it no longer would have been the same. But now I can look at the dual threat ability. Keyshawn Johnson isn't there. And this man was everything for the passing game. And understand that, it's funny because we were talking about this, Mason and I were talking about this too. And it's so funny when I'm able to bring conversations that I have with my friends onto the podcast, because a lot of times I'm talking to myself. I don't know how y'all feel about people who talk to themselves. I talk to myself, right? Especially when I'm talking out these topics and breaking them down. But it's nothing like actually having somebody to go back and forth with when you're looking at a topic. So when he mentions the weapons and he's like, well, who's 2 and 3? My initial response to him immediately was, I don't care who 2 and 3 is, second and third leading receivers, that is, and if they're coming back, because Keyshawn Johnson was so much a part of that passing game that 2 and 3 is kind of irrelevant. You have to prove it to me on the field that I can consider you a threat, because last year it was Keyshawn Johnson and Keyshawn Johnson. Like that was the threats for them through the air. No disrespect. They were just distant seconds to what he was able to do. There was nobody who produced at the level that he did. And it was so distant that maybe Keyshawn was just that good. Maybe he was just that good, but it did reflect poorly upon the other threats. But overall, like I said, I needed a couple of days. And now that I've had a couple of days, I've seen the vision. I've seen the vision. Andrew Body can fit in Alabama State's offense because Andrew Body can run the ball really, really well. I don't care if you want to be a run-first offense, as long as Andrew Body is a focal point. Davius Richard did not have more carries than Latrell Collier, but he was a very important part of that North Carolina Central running game. And obviously he was the quarterback, so he was a big part of that as well. That's what I want to see for Andrew Body. He can be close, 30, like not even close, like not five carries or anything, but he can be the second leading rusher. He can be the second leading rusher, but you got to allow him to pass the ball. Maybe that was personnel that you didn't want to throw the ball with last year, but you got Andrew Body. If you go in and you limit Body as a passer, I believe that you are doing a disservice to him as a player in his own development. And I also believe you're doing a disservice to your team. This is an extremely talented player that you have to use all of his talents. And by that, I'm looking at his ability to throw. I'm looking at his ability to run. If you want to be a running football team, you can have Andrew Body as your starting quarterback, but you got to make sure that you use the other part of his game as well. Now, as we move forward, we're not going to look at players who are in college anymore. We're not going to look at the guys who made it to the NFL. But what about those who tried to make that jump and unfortunately weren't able to? Or as Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson says, all the 54s out there who were just one guy off from making that active roster. Unfortunately, the unification of the USFL and the XFL, as great as that is for professional spring football, I don't know how great it is for those players who are trying to get into this league, and we'll get into that as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. And if you go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege, you can get the right person for your job, for your team, ASAP, and do it for FREE. We just spelling today. I feel like Snoop and Boosie, right? We spelling today because if you go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege, then you'll be able to post your job so everybody can see it. 800 million people go on LinkedIn on a daily basis. It's that popular. So if you're looking for candidates, you have more than enough options, and you can also make sure that you find the right person. No more coming into the office and just hearing what they have to say and taking what's put in front of you. You go be proactive. You go get out there and you find the person that's going to be able to affect your team in a positive fashion. Remember, a vacancy at one part of the team doesn't only affect that department. It can affect multiple departments because you're working to try to cover up for it. So go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Today's episode, or as we continue rolling with today's episode, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because I'm done doesn't mean that you're done. It's time for you to make your second listen Locked On Sports today, the first of its kind, 24/7 YouTube sports network all day, every day. No matter when I'm done talking, you might find somebody new. 3 a.m., 3 p.m. Go ahead and check out Locked On Sports today. We've looked at Andrew Body. We've looked at a collegiate player who's trying to make his way to the professional ranks. But what about those who did make their way to the professional ranks? And I'll specify HBCU players here, but this is way bigger than just HBCU players. The XFL-USFL merger is a huge deal, and it's a good deal when you're looking at spring football, when you're looking at the future of professional spring football, not collegiate games, not the spring games, but professional spring football. I think that this merger is a really good thing for the brand. I don't think that it's a great thing for HBCU athletes or athletes in general. Excuse me. So as a fan of the sport, I love that the XFL and the USFL came together. I'm a huge fan of that as a fan of the sport because I love football. I'll take spring football, fall football, winter football, summer football. I'll take any kind of football that you would give me. I will watch it. I'll take old football. I'll take future football. I'll take present football. I love this sport. So as somebody who feels so passionately about the sport, I'm very happy about this because I think that it kind of solidifies it. I don't know where the USFL was. Be honest with you, I was an XFL guy, Arlington Renegades, right? So because you had a team in my city, I'm rocking with the team in my city. I didn't watch much USFL. And I just have a lot of things going on in the spring. So it's typically a little bit more difficult for me to dedicate myself to it. But the XFL seemed to be on solid ground. I can't speak too much towards the USFL. From the outside looking in, it felt like it was on solid ground, felt like it had a strong foundation. And putting two organizations with strong foundations together is kind of a big part of why I say what I say. Great for spring football, not so much for the players. Now, when you're bringing in two strong foundations, then at the worst, you're going to have a strong foundation. At best, you're going to have a stronger foundation in the United Football League. That's what it's called, excuse me. The XFL-USFL merger is now the United Football League. Great. I now feel confident that for the foreseeable future, we're going to have spring football. Love that. I'm trying to make sure I get all my good points out because I don't want to seem like a negative Nancy or a negative Nathan. I'm a man. I don't want to just seem overly, poo-poo on the topic. That's really a good deal. Overall, the good outweighs the bad. So I want to make sure that I'm expressing how much the good outweighs the bad without coming in and being pessimistic about it. But yeah, so it's great for the brand. I get to watch United Football Leagues. They took, I believe, 5 from the XFL, 3 from the USFL. But therein lies the problem. Yes, the more concrete future of spring football now means Well, the players will for sure have somewhere to go for the foreseeable future. That's great. The stronger united, no pun intended, but the stronger united front that they're putting on, or the stronger united brand that they're building. Let me not say front, because I think it's true and I think it's real. I agree with it. The stronger united brand now allows you to continue playing spring football in the future, but it limits your opportunities. Because how many teams did I just say was in the UFL? 8. That's the current league. The USFL, which is now no longer in existence, I'll put that in air quotes, had 8 teams. The XFL had 8 teams. So you're no longer competing against each other, which is good for your brand. You'll have more viewers. Like all of these things start to tick up, but you also have less opportunities for these players. Now, instead of 16 teams, you have 8 teams. And each of these 8 teams have 50 players on the active roster, right? 43 on game day, but 50 throughout the week. Okay, perfectly fine. I don't know how many off the top of my head were in the XFL, USFL. I didn't look it up because it doesn't matter. Because no matter how you want to spin it, I bet you it's not 20. They wasn't going in there with 20, 30 players. They were going in there with close to 50. So you have 16 teams with close to 50. So now you just went from 800 players playing spring football to 400. That's a drastic drop off. There's other routes to go. There's other things for you to do, and people will figure it out. The same way that the guys who didn't make the USFL or the XFL were able to figure it out. People who don't make this UFL will now figure it out. But I don't know if it's a great thing for HBCU athletes. I don't know if it's a great thing for players who are trying to make that next leap, because you have limited opportunities. Prayers and love to those who are able to make it. I'm sending the best. And they just had the UFL draft, so I felt this was timely to talk about. I thought this was timely to talk about. Once again, the good outweighs the bad, and I'll leave it at that because I don't want to just seem super negative about the subject. I think that the merger is great. I'm a fan of football before I am an analyst, right? Like I have been a fan of football before I've been an analyst. So the fan in me says, okay, I feel confident that for the next 3-5 years, I'll be able to watch the UFL. I'll be able to watch some of these guys. So overall, let me end it with the good note, but that doesn't take away from the negative part. It's good and bad. I wanted to look at both sides of the coin. There we go. Yeah, I feel good at wrapping that up. I feel like I wasn't a negative Nathan. So as we move forward, there's nothing to be negative about when you're looking at Florida A&M women's basketball versus Grambling women's basketball, because they just put on a triple overtime thriller. Is that the game of the year? Too early to tell, but not too early to start speculating. And we'll look at this game as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by Jase Medical. That's JASE medical.com. Go to jasemedical.com and make sure you use the code Locked On. When you use the code Locked On, you get $20 off your first purchase. When you go, make sure you get yourself the Jase case. I call it the just in case case, but it's technically called the Jase case. And the reason I call it what I call it is because you never know what's going to happen. You never know what's going to happen, especially with your health. You don't want to be caught in a situation where you were unprepared simply because you didn't know what was going to happen. Be proactive, not reactive. I think I said that in the last one too. Be proactive, not reactive, meaning if you get the Jase case, they'll have 5 antibiotics that are meant to treat over 50 infections. You can't even name 50 infections. Like, let's just be real. You can't name 50 infections unless you're some sort of doctor or working in the medical field. So when it comes to those 50 infections you can't name, go get the Jase case, because you're going to have 5 antibiotics that are meant to treat more infections than you can name. It's just that simple. Go to jasemedical.com and use the code Locked On. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. We're going into another week of great NFL action. My favorite game in the playoffs this week is likely going to be, I can't pick one. I got to go two. It's going to be the Ravens versus the Texans, and then the 49ers versus the Packers. I love those 2 games. I can't tell you which way to sway. I can't tell you which way to put your money down, but I will tell you that if you're new to FanDuel, in a way, it doesn't matter. You put down a $5 bet win or lose. So if you pick the Packers and the 49ers win, or if you pick the Ravens and the Texans win, it doesn't matter. Pick the winner, pick the loser. You're still going to get $150 back in bonus bets. That's what's important. Now, hopefully you win and you get 150 up bonus bets, including or on top of your earnings. But overall, either way, you're a winner. That's only if you're new to FanDuel, though. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more. As we wrap up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3. And I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Thank you. Let's look at this FAMU versus Grambling women's basketball game, because does having a 3 overtime game make you the game of the year? No, it doesn't. But when we're only 4, when you're looking at Grambling is 3-1 after their victory. FAMU's 1-2 after their loss. Like, when you're this early in the season to where FAMU could either have a winning or a losing record strictly based off the outcome of this game, this is extremely early in the conference play. This is an early contestant for game of the year. It was a thriller. It went all the way to 3 overtimes. And when you make it to 3 overtimes, 9 times out of 10, this is going to be one that is in the conversation, and this is not number 10. This is either 1, 7, or 5. It's one of the 9. Trust me. So when I look at this game, it'll get me paying attention, strictly being a 3 overtime game. I think the most interesting point is how the 3rd overtime, the final overtime, in a way is a microcosm of the entire game, because it followed the same script that regulation did, just in a significantly shortened amount of time. So in the 3rd overtime, I know there was a point where FAMU felt like if they weren't controlling this game, they were on the cusp of controlling this game. And that was with about 2:51 left, I think it was. 2:50. So let's just say 3 minutes left. Let's not get specific. With about 3 minutes left in the 3rd overtime, in the 5-minute quarter, I felt as if they probably felt they were on the verge of establishing control. It was only a 4-point lead. In no way is that a safe lead. In no way is that a safe lead at all. But it wasn't something they had in the previous overtime or the overtime before that. In the 1st overtime, FAMU was pretty much battling from behind most of the time. In the 2nd overtime, they had the lead, but they were only 2 points ahead. Now, I understand that 1-score game, 2-score games, not really a thing in basketball, but I'm a football guy, so I'm going to use some football terminology to relate back to the hardwood. They were up 2 points. At any moment, they could have been down 1. Any moment, they could have been down 1. Could have tied. Now, when you're up 4, you trust that they're not going to make up that deficit in one time down the court. So you're trusting that you're not going to foul on the 3-point that they make, and then they make the bucket, and now the game's tied. But even with that, at the worst, there's nothing else unless you start incorporating technicals and all of that. But that's a different, that's an exception, right? We're not going to that. You're not going to be down whenever they go down the court. It's just not going to happen. So that's the little bit of confidence you had. And then Grambling called a timeout. FAMU was up 4. They're probably feeling like I'm on the cusp of establishing some sort of control. And then Grambling called a timeout. And once Grambling called that timeout in the 3rd overtime, it was up. It was done for FAMU. FAMU did not score another point. They had 85 points when Grambling called that timeout. They ended the game with 85 points. After that timeout, Grambling scored every single time they went down the court for the next 3 possessions. And 4 out of the last 5 possessions of the game, they scored some sort of point, whether it was a free throw because of a intentional foul, or if it was just going down there and scoring a bucket, right? They scored every time they went down the court except for once after calling that timeout. That timeout, because I told you that the 3rd overtime is a microcosm of the whole game, specifically regulation. That timeout essentially represented halftime, and it was almost halfway through the 3rd overtime as well. In the first quarter and second quarter, Grambling scored 11 points, giving them 22 at halftime compared to FAMU's 38. Not an insurmountable deficit at all, clearly. But you look at what they did in the third quarter, they scored 25. So they doubled their point total. In the third quarter alone, they scored more than they scored in the first half. In the fourth quarter, they scored 17. You look at the third overtime, they didn't make a bucket until they called that timeout. FAMU had a 4-point lead. I'm not going to blow up the lead. Then as soon as the timeout was had, they went from not being able to score, not being able to get a stop because FAMU scored every single time down the court before that timeout, to getting all of the stops and making all of the baskets, getting all of the points. This is a microcosm of the rest of the game, specifically in regulation. They couldn't score in the first half, struggled to stop. They lit it up in the second half and began to get stops. FAMU had a 10-point quarter at one point. When you look at what Grambling started with and then where they ended, I told you they scored 11 in the first quarter, 11 in the second quarter. Screw what they did in the third and fourth quarter, right? Clearly their offense took a catapult in those quarters. Grambling scored 8 points in overtime, first overtime, 7 points in the second overtime, 9 points in the third overtime. Those are 5-minute quarters. The first and second are 10 minutes apiece. Grambling nearly matched their point total in each of those 5-minute quarters to what they did in 10-minute quarters. That just tells you how much better that they were playing in once halftime. And that's the same way that I look at that third overtime timeout. This was a good one. You saw the switch. I don't know what happened. I don't know what was said. But whether you look at halftime or if you look at that timeout halfway through the third overtime, there was a clear switch that happened for Grambling. They began to be able to score the ball, and they got a bunch of stops. FAMU didn't score again after Grambling called that timeout. Didn't score a single basket, didn't make a free throw, didn't do nothing. Coincidence? I don't know. Too much for me, though. Now, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day. Every day on tomorrow's episode, we're going to bring back the FAMU topic because they're doing they're finishing their coaching search with a hiring firm. And I think that Tiffany Dawn Sykes is doing what is best for her and probably what's best for this situation at this point. But we'll get into that on tomorrow. I just wanted to let it breathe, and hopefully I get more information as we go through Thursday morning or Wednesday morning. So in the meantime, in between time, follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care. Stay blessed. Peace.